I've got it. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the slow start. We're gonna get it right. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Mike Alexander. I'm the director of the Center for Livable Communities at the Atlanta Regional Commission. And with me today is the other Mike, Mike Carnathan, affectionately known as Mike C, and I'm often called Mike A. And together we are Mike and Mike. And you see that in the graphic on the first slide. For those of you that don't know, that graphic is actually quite old. It's at least 7 years old. We started off doing a Mike and Mike show to present our regional snapshots many, many years ago, as it turns out. And we were so good at it that we stopped doing it. So we thought, given the current webinar format at the ARC, we would break back out the Mike and Mike program to spend some time with you today talking about what we know or what we think we know about the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis. And so we're going to spend about an hour with you today, and all I can say is courage. We appreciate you having the courage to be with us as we do what we do, which is dive into the data. And that's the place that I think Mike and I are the happiest. And of course, we look forward to showing you everything that we put together today for you, which I hope you'll find, if not interesting, at least entertaining. So if we take any liberties today, please know that we recognize how serious the current environment is, how tenuous everything is. And when we present that information, know that we recognize that this is a critical time in Atlanta's history and US history, and we're always thinking about that. And a lot of the information that we're going to show you today reflects those concerns that we see through the data, and hopefully it'll help you to be better in your work and understanding what's happening now, what's likely to happen in the future. So with that, the last thing I'll say is I know almost everyone should have done hundreds of webinars by now. We are using the GoToMeeting webinar. We are going to reserve time at the end to answer any and all questions that you want to put to us. So please feel free to put those in the chat as we're presenting, and we'll hold those until the end and try to respond to them as best we can, recognizing that you've got Mike and Mike, and our information can at times be limited. So we'll do our best. Please hang with us, and we're so happy you're with us today for the next hour.
All right, well, I'm going to take over now, and just in case y'all don't know Mike A and I, Mike A is the one on the left. So that'll just give you a good visual image of who is who here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start us off, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do today with this presentation. Now, typically when Mike and I or anybody else at the agency is asked to give a presentation about the state of the economy in Metro Atlanta, and of course this would be pre-pandemic, we rely on traditional labor market information that typically has a lag of maybe a month, maybe 2 months, maybe up to a year. And one of the things that we quickly realized is that relying on traditional labor market information during a pandemic, well, that lag time is just not going to be sufficient. And so what we're going to really be focusing on is as much real-time information as we can get. We're going to be looking at things like human movement, you know, how we're moving around, how we're interacting with the economy. And there's lots and lots of data tools out there that allow us to do that. We're also going to rely on some surveys that ask us about how we're feeling, feelings of safety, how we're perceiving the safety of interacting with the economy. Because in order for the economy to get back to full steam, we're going to have to feel safe in how we're interacting with businesses and how we're interacting with restaurants, bars, movie theaters, all of those things that have clearly taken a drubbing during this pandemic. And the second thing that makes this an interesting and a different presentation than what we're normally giving is that we can't talk about the economy without talking about public health, because the virus will decide the status of the economic recovery, and how we interact and how we react to what's happening on the public health side will inform what's happening with the economy. Now, so that's what we're going to do. So that's sort of the ground rules. We're going to go through lots and lots and lots of data. And really, if you look at all the different data sources we have, you'll see that it's a lot of data. And we actually recognized that early on, that there's so much data out there that we needed to do something to help people kind of parse through that data. And so Mike A actually had a good idea about how to do that. So I'll turn it over to Mike real quick to talk about our COVID weekly report.
Yeah, Mike, and thank you. I can't believe you acknowledged that I had a good idea.
Well, I said actually a good idea. So.
And I do want to point out that, that's a black and white image, the first slide, and I'm seeing a lot more gray in your hair than 7 years ago, but that's not represented in the graphic. I'm just saying. Yeah, Mike makes a critical point. I think if you're paying attention to the news, which I think almost everyone on this webinar is, you're swimming in information. And I know we were swimming to the point of almost being overwhelmed by the amount of information. And so Mike's staff and some of the staff from transportation here at the ARC and CLC worked hard to collect a lot of different information. And Layla Bellows and one of our interns, Nikolai, formed it up into this report. And of course, if you click on the link in the bottom, you yourself can go to the blog, our blog, 33 North, and look at each weekly report. And we release these reports on Friday. And what we're trying to do is give you a 5-minute update on this wide range of health, economic, and movement data so that you can quickly understand what's happening, in particular in the 10-county area. A lot of this information goes down to the county level as well, which is helpful to understand what locally is you're experiencing in your own communities. And so if you look at this, I parsed and put back together 2 of the key tables in this report so that you could see that. Now, we spent a lot of time looking at this COVID reported health data on the Department of Public Health website. They do publish preliminary data, and they're continually updating data. So data that's published by a date may actually get revised and changed, reflecting more collection that they've done. So you'll see, and critically in this report, you'll see us publish preliminary, and then later on we'll update these data points in our own databases that we use to make these reports. So when you see new cases, you'll see preliminary, and then the following week that data may change. And that's a critical thing to understand when you're looking at the new case data down at the county level. And again, based on those preliminary cases, you can see that weekly case change. And this is through July 11th. And you can see those greens, there's a decline, but I think we all recognize, and we'll show you in some of the other tools that our amazing staff has built, how this is bouncing around at a much higher level than it was 4 weeks ago. And of course, unemployment insurance claims, if you could go back just for a second, Mike, we're going to talk a lot about unemployment, and it's all over the news. But again, we wanted you to see on a weekly basis how our counties were doing. These numbers are still exceptional. We never thought, Mike and I and the rest of the staff never thought we would be publishing claims numbers as high as we're seeing. We're going to talk in a little more detail about how that's been going. But again, in this report, if you sign up for it and get this regular email, you'll see that unemployment as well as movement. In a place like Fulton County on the far right, you can see the total amount of vehicle miles traveled, which we're getting almost on a daily basis now. To speak to what Mike was saying earlier about this new data we've been getting that's almost real time, it's still down dramatically, these vehicle miles traveled, almost still 50% from prior to this COVID pandemic. So again, we're watching these numbers, and you can watch them too with us to see how we do coming out of the recession, and of course, as we work through the pandemic itself. Next slide, Mike. And of course, Shishin Fan and Transportation built this particular tool, and you'll see the link in the bottom left. This is updated as of this morning, And you can see at the MSA level on the far right, the big case difference between Metro Atlanta and the rest of the metros in the state, but also the non-metro areas. And what's fascinating about this tool is you can look at all those counties that don't get counted in MSA areas and how much their case counts have gone up as well. So we opened back up in May. We thought we were doing better, and I think we all understand this. The cases have gone up dramatically. What makes this tool so valuable is that you can look at counties very easily, and you can look at metropolitan areas as well across the state. So we built this tool. So every county in the state is represented in this tool. And of course, on the left are our core 10 counties. And you can see that increase through June, with it bouncing around a little bit. In the last couple of days, the data has actually gone down. But Fulton, Gwinnett, DeKalb, and Cobb, our largest counties by population, have the highest case rates, dramatically higher than our small counties.
And so Mike, as Mike said, we know that the case counts are going up, and they've been going up dramatically for the last month. And what this chart is showing you, even though you can't really read the labels, is the blue bar is number of cases, gray bar is number of hospitalizations. And so you'll see how those are rising in tandem. And then you see the orange bar is the number of deaths. And for the longest time, the number of deaths were declining, but we know that the number of deaths and the death count is going to lag probably 4 to 6 weeks behind cases, behind new confirmed cases. And so what we've seen the last couple of weeks is the counts of deaths due to COVID slowly creeping up, and with the caseloads as the way they are, we're going to expect that to continue. So now what we're going to do is, now that we've looked at the sort of the public health side of it, and again, as I said at the beginning, what happens in that public health side of this equation is going to determine how we're going to recover economically. And that always boils down to human behavior. And so the next few slides, we're going to show some data that we're accessing to give us sort of a real-time look at this human behavior. This is looking at Open Table. Now, for those who go out on dates and go to restaurants, you go to Open Table and you can book reservations at a restaurant. Well, obviously, at the end of March and the beginning of April, nobody was doing that. Restaurants were closed. But as we started reopening, as we started feeling a little bit more comfortable returning to the economy, you see those bookings in these states slowly, sometimes sharply, start creeping back up. And right around the last week of June, and this is where we start reacting to the virus. We start looking at the caseloads, and we're changing our behavior based on that. And so this is a tool that we get from Open. This is data that we get from Open Table. And this is a tool that we built internally using cell phone data. Again, we're tracking cell phones, where cell phones go. And what this chart shows us is this is just movement to restaurants. So any movement from home to a restaurant is tracked with this tool. And here's the link to it right here. You can get it on our blog, or you can get it on Neighborhood Nexus. But you'll see a couple of weeks ago, we saw across the board declines in people traveling around outside of their house. And what we took that to being is that, okay, humans are beginning to behave differently because caseloads are rising. Well, this just goes and teaches us a lesson is, you need to look at this longer than 1 week, because 1 week does not make a trend. And so when we updated this week, yesterday in fact, we see that mobility is increasing again. So again, this just represents time traveling to restaurants. And so, but if you look at overall, you see the movement is still down some 20%. And so that means that compared to normal times, these places are still only operating at 80% capacity, which is going to have obvious ramifications for commercial real estate. And so, Mike, talk a little bit about this slide.
Yeah, this is an article I found just a couple days ago that really speaks to something we don't often think about, but the consequences for the real estate community, given all these business closings, is going to be very real, and it will take a long time for this recovery to occur. And so what you can see is, like the way you would think about home mortgages, you know, people have loans associated with commercial real estate as well. And so if you look at that red line shooting way up to 24%, that's delinquent hotel loans and how they've spiked nationally. And then the map, I cut and pasted this in just so you could see, if you look at the delinquency balances of these commercial mortgages, you can see where Metro Atlanta stands. So a place like New York, really one of the largest economic zones on the planet, that exposure is very high, $7 billion. And Atlanta, smaller, you can see that $690 million in exposure. And then by property type in the bottom left, you can see that difference. Back in January, only 1.5 of the loans were delinquent, and that shot up to 24%. And all we want to do to show in showing this is to say, hey, we've got to be really thinking about the complete economy and what this really means as we're trying to come out of this recession. So we're hurting at the individual level, we're hurting at the business level, and then a lot of the back end of our economy that we don't often think about is going to be hurt as well through these commercial mortgages.
Yeah, and we see that a lot too if we're just looking at just small businesses. This is data from JP Morgan Chase, and what they're doing is they're looking at balances of small businesses. And the orange line here represents Metro Atlanta. And Metro Atlanta during this pandemic has actually seen the greatest decline in balances in these bank accounts. Now, we don't have a good explanation for why that is, but what the takeaway here is that all of these data, how we're reacting to this virus is taking its toll on all corners of the economy. And we can also look at this, and so this all comes in spite of Metro Atlanta is doing relatively well in terms of staying home. So this is that Google mobility data, and we can look at it for every single county, and we can look at it for every single metro. This light blue line represents the percent change in time away from home since kind of January. And you see Atlanta sort of, the decline is sort of in the upwards top of the pack. And then we can also look at perception data. Now, if you look at the chart to the right, this is a survey that goes out nationally that looks at, just perceptions of safety, of how we're feeling about, say, dining in a restaurant or just returning to normal. And you'll see the majority of Americans feel it's either a large risk or a moderate risk to do these things. So we're still perceiving that it's not terribly safe to return to pre-pandemic levels. Now, if you look to the chart on the left, the line chart, you'll see that despite our general feeling of, it's not safe, despite that, we are visiting friends more often. We are dining in restaurants more often, and we're self-quarantining less often. So this gets back to that human behavior, and this just gets back to how we're kind of reacting with the economy. And so that is, again, how we perceive the safety and interacting with this economy is going to go a long way to determining how our economy recovers. So talking about the economy, Mike, why don't you talk about this slide a little bit?
I know. I think, Mike, you did a great job of the lead up. So we're going to push on. And of course, this is a Mike Carnathan slide.
It's actually my birthday. May 8th is my birthday.
It is, and that's the point. It was your birthday, and of course, your birthday is now represented by this horrible fact for all of us. The worst economic day in U.S. history when the May jobs report was released. And of course, if you know us, we were all emailing about it in anticipation of what it would be. We knew it was going to be bad. We didn't know, even as much as we were thinking about it, the scale of job decline that is represented on this chart. And it's without precedent, obviously, in U.S. economic history. So we know that this is completely serious. But again, if you're reading the articles, this may go down as the shortest recession in U.S. history, but the most severe. And so I've continued to use this slide to represent this idea that, man, we've shut down the economy. We really cut demand. People couldn't go to restaurants. They couldn't engage in their normal economic activity. It had a horrible effect. But again, turning back on the economy, and the May jobs report was bad, but we know we're adding jobs again, right? And so that's been critical for us to understand. And we lean to people like Mark Zandi, pictured on the right, the economist for Moody's, who I listen to the most when I'm trying to understand the national economy. When he says that the recession is over, you can take with some confidence that that's true. But if you read that text, and we know we violated every PowerPoint slide rule you could possibly have with this slide, you'll see some core ideas that we think are important. The recovery is tenuous at best, and we know continuing to increase the money supply for the United States is going to be critical if we're going to keep energy in the economy and not slide back into another recession. And that's what those two articles are about. And you're going to feel that in the rest of our slides as we're thinking about what it's really going to take for Metro Atlanta to sustain a recovery that doesn't slip back into a recession. Yeah, and for those of you who have ever seen Mike A. give a presentation, this is a very typical Mike A. slide. It has all words on it. Thank you, I think. And of course, yeah, sure. Given that, we've dusted off this slide. Some of you have already seen me present this chart. It's from Calculated Risk. I think the world of that website, if you don't go to it, he is just the publisher of the world of economic data. And he developed this chart during the Great Recession. And what it really shows you is how many months it took to get back to previous pre-recession employment levels. And these are the years of the recession, color-coded. And so you see recessions from 48 to 2020. And of course, in blue is the Great Recession and how long it took us to get back. So during this recession, this pandemic recession, you'll see how dramatic those job declines were compared to other recessions. That's why this chart is so important. It just puts a scale on what we're going through right now. And Mike just clicked forward to show you 2 good months of job data where we were adding jobs again. Hopefully that will continue. And that's what we want to see, right? And that's what we're wondering about when we get the next month's jobs report. And so we will continue to update this slide in our presentations when we're out talking to see how this recovery is actually going. Next slide. And so to put a fine point on it, I mean, April was absolutely brutal. I mean, you saw that red line plunging beneath anything that we've ever seen. And the simple fact of the matter is no corner of the economy was untouched here. You're looking at, leisure and hospitality sectors, the other services sector just took a beating in April. Now, the last 2 job reports have, we've seen steady growth, but if you take it where we are in June, we still are talking about around 5 years of job gains that have been wiped out in these last 3 months. And, the longest time, we saw a very happy trend where layoffs were declining every single week, really since the middle of May until the latest jobs report. And now we've seen an uptick in these initial unemployment insurance claims.
And that is not a trend that we want to see continue, but that's why we do this week over week, so we can see, again, how the labor market is responding to this virus.
Absolutely. And this is, as Mark Zandi is saying in his latest reports, the U.S. economy is sputtering right now. And I think that couldn't be a more accurate word. Those bars are still dramatically higher than normal uninsured, unemployment insurance claims. The far left, you'll see that's like 2,200 claims in a week. That's very normal. And so we were declining, but then we started to uptick again. And so that certainty that we'd like to have that we were on the right path is challenged right now with this latest chart. So this is a particularly troubling chart for us, and we don't want to be sputtering. We want to have and feel the gas pedal depressed with a good engine forcing us forward.
And again, we know where these unemployed, where the newly unemployed concentrate, where they're concentrated. It's in the hospitality and leisure sectors. It's in arts entertainment. It's in food accommodation, and it's in other services sector, which includes very high touch occupations like barbers, like nail salons, things like that. And those are the ones that are continuing to suffer. And because of these local government, because of these businesses suffering, you see that local government revenues are taking the hit.
And you can see that so much of the local government revenue is generated because of sales taxes. And if you were looking at Mike's previous slide, if you're not out spending in the restaurants and you're not buying hotel rooms, it's going to have a dramatic impact. So a place like Fulton County, which has lots of hotel rooms and lots of restaurants, is being particularly hit during this recession. You see those big downward blues for May over May and June over June. But again, we have some of our more suburban counties where actually there's been an uptick compared to the previous year. So that's a good thing. But on the whole, most of our counties' local government revenues are still down dramatically.
And, again, we'll come back to small businesses here. You'll see that for the longest time, we've seen more and more businesses reopen. But then again, the virus is going to have a say-so in what happens to this economy. And so now we're beginning to see those small businesses close again.
And we're not out of the woods yet. We can't say this enough, that we have data that is current as July 11th on small businesses being open is truly amazing to us. And again, we will be following this data closely. I know Mike and I really think the world of Raj Chetty up in Harvard, and he's put this website together, and he really has spent a lot of great energy trying to understand what the real impacts are on low-income workers and small businesses in particular. And we're going to break this down in more detail. But critically, you can see Metro Atlanta's small businesses being closed is at a higher percentage than even New York City as of July 11th. So we know we've got a long way to go. We were hoping that those lines would continue to go up, but we're bouncing around again or in decline. We don't like to look at a single week anymore, but we are watching this very closely.
And now that he just said we don't like to look at a single week, here we are looking at a single week. This is the last week of data showing how Metro Atlanta compares in terms of the percent change in the small businesses being opened. You'll see like areas like New Orleans, they're leading the country. Their small businesses are struggling. Metro Atlanta is more in the middle of the pack, sort of maybe upper middle of the pack.
Yeah, and I know this is only a week, but I want to give Mike a shout out because he pulled this data out of that website to make these regional comparisons. So that's a little bit of work on his part, but I think it tells a very interesting story about the relative differences in the economies of these metropolitan places. So if you can go back for just a second, Mike. He's breaking up a little bit. You can see a place like Omaha, which has a very different economy from New Orleans. and the relative differences in how their small businesses are doing right now. So if you get a chance, once you download this PowerPoint, take a few minutes to look at this. There's a lot of lines at a very similar level, but there's some big differences as well. And so this all boils down to really consumer spending. Well, you know, when we talk about the economics of the United States, 70% of our GDP is consumer spending. People making decisions to put their money into the economy. So again, this is really, really critical information from Opportunity Insights to show you how Metro Atlanta is doing on consumer spending. And we're not doing well compared to the United States, almost double in percentage the rate for the United States as of July 8th. So again, looking at these trends, very different from the trough back in April. That's a great thing, but not back up to pre-shutdown levels. So we've got a ways to go, but definitely better than we were.
Yeah, and a few economists are, you know, talking about kind of the 85 to 90% economy, which, you know, that may be what we're looking at over the next, you know, year, 2 years. So that consumer spending data is going to be important to track, because if we're still only spending at 85 to 90% of what we used to be spending, well, that just means that, you know, we're going to have a pretty bumpy, longer recovery than what we initially had hoped for. And here's
Mike, what are your thoughts about Nashville?
Yeah, so here we're looking at just percent change in consumer spending since January. Again, Metro Atlanta is in that light blue, but look at Nashville. And I don't have a great story behind why Nashville is getting so killed right now in terms of consumer spending. But you'll see just the wide differences metro to metro and how people are reacting to this economy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of variation here geographically with similar levels. So that's only to say a Louisville and San Francisco are not in that fundamentally a different place, but a Baltimore and a Jacksonville and a Honolulu are up, which I think for us is a little bit surprising given travel restrictions, but it is what it is at this point. So we're going to continue to investigate this data.
And one thing that we do know and that we are tracking very closely is what's happening to our low-income workers. We've talked ad nauseum about the industries that are being affected the most. Those are mostly low-wage, low-income occupations. And sure enough, if you can isolate just on what's happening to our low-income workers, well, they're taking a beating. And they're taking a beating particularly here in Metro Atlanta. So you'll see this particular data only goes through May. So even through the end of May, you'll see roughly 44% of low-income workers have lost their jobs when compared to pre-pandemic levels. And then you compare Metro Atlanta to other metropolitan areas, a couple of stories emerge. Number one, Metro Atlanta really kind of vaults to the top in terms of the change in employment among low-income workers. But the other part of the story, there's no MSA, there's no major metro area in this country that isn't suffering, where low-income workers are doing significantly better. In fact, in every single metro in the nation, at least 30% of low-income workers have lost their jobs. And we can look at that spatially here locally in Metro Atlanta. These polygons represent zip codes. And so you'll see the darker areas represent where the greatest numbers of low-income workers have lost their jobs.
And one of the things that Mike and I have been talking about is the fact that some of those deep reds are in very affluent zip codes as well. So there's where a low-income worker lives, and there's where a low-income worker actually goes to work. And this is something that's been reported on nationally, that where you have high-income zip codes, typical spending is still down, even though their relative employment rates are similar. So we talk about perceptions of safety. This map, even though it looks very generic, is critical for us to understand, because in high-income areas, people aren't going out to restaurants at the same rate. And the result of that is it really does impact the low-income workers that historically would have been in those restaurants that those high-income workers would have gone to. So it presents a particular challenge for this recession, and how to meet that and help those workers in the best way possible, knowing that they really can't go back to work until people absolutely feel safe and return to those historical consumption patterns.
And here is just a map that we always like to make. If you ever see a presentation that Mike and I give, we always like to give sort of a spatial overview of the region and where certain conditions are concentrated. And so what we did is we mapped where threatened workers live. So this is where workers live, and the darker the browns and the oranges represent the greatest concentrations of workers working in either food and accommodation or arts and entertainment businesses. And so you'll see a very familiar pattern. If you've seen Mike and I present these data, you'll see kind of the south side of the area having heavier concentrations of those threatened workers. Then you can start comparing it to other maps. So you'll see the heaviest concentrations of people of color, a lot of overlap there. You'll see percent of low birth weight births. We often use this as sort of a proxy for general kind of unhealthiness. But again, you'll see very similar, some of the same areas popping out on both of these maps. You'll look at the percent lacking health insurance. Again, looking at the public health angle here, you'll see many of the same areas popping out. And then finally, looking at poverty, the maps look very, very similar. The point being here is, if you look pre-pandemic and you look at the areas that were struggling before this pandemic became a pandemic, well, those are the same areas that are struggling even more now, with both the public health aspect of this and the economic aspect of this.
Absolutely.
And so it really does just come down to, it's about people.
And we can't say this enough. When we look at all this information, we put together all these slides and charts, lots of numbers. We want to make sure we say to you directly that this is about people. This recession, as much as any in the US's history, is having a horrible impact on our residents least likely, least capable to cope with the impacts that are happening to them. So whatever else we put up in with respect to data, you know, we've got to be thinking about how we can help people, because we know this recession and the recovery is going to be a very weak one. And you were going to, you know, add a lot of jobs nationally 1 month, but if things are trending the way they are, we don't expect that to continue. And with the case rates going up as well, it's going to be hard for small businesses and those businesses we've been talking about to stay open. And so those businesses staying open really is about the people that have been working in them. And so this next slide, I think, really starts to get at this and understanding what this means, especially to people of color.
Yeah, and so this is looking at, you know, a recent survey by the National Bureau of Economic Research, where it shows that business owners of color are significantly more likely to have their business closed than any other business. And this pertains to Black business owners, Latinx business owners, and immigrant business owners. So it's not just, we're not just talking about workers of color who are suffering here. We're also talking about business owners of color who are suffering disproportionate impacts due to this pandemic.
And I can't say this enough, Mike, you got to go back for just a second. This is this number is so hard for us to look at. That percentage decrease for Black-owned businesses, 41%. 41%. Everybody's being hurt by this recession, but Black business owners are really struggling in this crisis, and we have to acknowledge that so fundamentally if we're going to make sure that our programs and resources are helping them in a way that we know will make them stronger in the long run. And we know we're going to lose a lot of businesses, and this is in and of itself a real tragedy. And so,
yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, businesses employ people. And so Mike did another, I think, wonderful service to us all by pulling this data out of the Census Household Pulse Survey, which is a new survey by the Census Bureau that I really am happy that the Census Bureau is doing, because it gives us real-time data about this. But this is about disparity, right? And so we've talked a lot about the sectors that were being impacted. We know in those lower wage sectors, more Black people work in those sectors, more Hispanic people work in those sectors. And so as a result, if you're looking at the household level, in Black households, 65% of all of those Black households in Metro Atlanta, at least one person has already lost a job. And we have to think about the economic consequences of that. It is absolutely tragic. And so we know they're hurting, everyone's hurting, but our Black community is struggling that much more given the consequences on our economy.
And of course, you know, loss of employment cascades into other aspects of your life. And so here the Census Bureau also asks about, you know, how confident are you that you're going to be able to make next month's rent? And you'll see Hispanics and Latinos, 45% who responded to this survey and who were renters have slight or no confidence that they're going to be able to make that rent payment. With Black populations, it's not quite as high, but still higher than other populations. So that loss of job is cascading into the housing market as well.
And so going back to the Census Pulse survey, but formatted a different way, this is something that I've been looking at weekly, is comparing Metro Atlanta to other large metros and that percentage of people who either miss last month's rent or feel like they have no confidence that they're going to make their rent next month. And so for Metro Atlanta, a couple weeks ago, that percentage was 25%, didn't think they were going to make their rent next month. Of course, Miami #1 at 43%. I can barely talk about that. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see the current most recent data we could pull. Metro Atlanta's number now has increased to 32%. So almost 1 in 3 households isn't certain that they're going to be able to make their rent. Of course, if you have these big layoffs, the 65% for Black households having lost a job, even with all the other benefits that we put into the economy, and the U.S. has put a lot of money into stimulus. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of that stimulus spending down to the individual level is about to end. And we know Congress is back in session. If it does end, or isn't at least put into motion again in some other way, then we would expect that this would become even more severe, given so many people just can't go back to work right now because their jobs aren't there anymore. We're going to struggle. There's no doubt about it. So this is great data that we're following very closely.
And, you know, in speaking of cascading effects, well, food insecurity comes into play here too. And you'll see the census asked the question, and this is the latest week they have available. They asked the question, percentage who indicated that they sometimes or often did not have enough food to eat last week. And you'll see Black households, 13.1% responded affirmatively to that. That's 3 times the level as white households.
And then we're going to spend a couple slides talking about what it means to really be shut down. And so if you're looking at just basic information from the Household Pulse Survey about resources that are available in the home, and I know our school systems are thinking a lot about this, but we wanted to make sure that we put some data into this deck to show you the disparities again by race or ethnicity just in Metro Atlanta. So if you're an Asian or a white household, more than 95% of you have a device available for learning, but that number goes down to 82% for a Black household. And it falls even further for internet available. Only 69% of Black households have internet available. And so when Mike and I heard some of our education policy experts saying and telling us how many children, in Fulton County's case, it was on the order of 20% of their students never logged in to digital learning, as it was reported to us. This chart becomes absolutely critical because we're all watching closely what the school systems are doing. And if we are going to go virtual, there's clearly going to be a gap in educational learning capacity at the household level here in Metro Atlanta.
Right, and most of the school districts in the 10-county area so far are choosing to go virtual, at least for some time. And so that means we're going to have to try a lot harder than we did at the end of last school year to make sure that all resources that are available to these school districts get to the people who need them the most.
Yes, let me say, I went ahead and put a link to this PowerPoint into the chat. We're multitasking here today with this presentation. So if you look in the chat now, you'll see a link that'll allow you to access the PowerPoint. But continuing with these education slides, this is a report from McKinsey on a wide range of impacts associated with learning in a virtual environment. And I'm not going to try to break this down in detail in the interest of time, but I do hope that you will take some time to download this link and look at it. They ran a number of scenarios based on generally accepted models of learning given different conditions, and that's what those scenarios are, and how much a student will potentially lose in instruction, actual learning, depending on whether they return in January 2021 or the fall of 2021. So this is, I think, very thoughtful information that explains that everyone loses in a virtual environment, even a high quality environment, but people of color, in particular, Black students, will lose the most as a result of these shutdowns. And that in no way implies that we think that everybody should go back to school. This is McKinsey's report, and we wanted to at least give you something to kind of scale up the impact associated with it. You know, everyone's health and safety is always our priority, but I think this is critical information to understand. If we have to do that for our own safety, there will be consequences. Again, it does not mean that Mike or anybody else recommends that we have to reopen the schools, but we did want you to have access to this report because I think it's valuable. So click on the next slide, Mike. And again, with 2 senior daughters, I can say this in full confidence. It's absolutely critical for us to make sure they're learning. We want them to prosper. And this idea really opened my own eyes at the personal level that even I had not been thinking about what it really means to be virtual and the consequences of that for even my own daughters. Never mind what this means for us as a nation as a result. And that's what these 2 bar charts are really about. Loss of earnings associated with less learning. Tragically, these virtual environments will lead to more kids dropping out of school. And that's going to have a huge impact on the United States. And then if you're not paying attention to that, you got to do the math. It's going to have an impact on GDP as well. So I think a very thoughtful report to get at this idea of what the consequences are for this current crisis on education.
Yeah, and I think, well, really what that just boils down to, and again, just to reiterate Mike's point, we're not suggesting that everyone has to go back to school. The virus is still there. We are just in a tough spot. Parents have school-age kids who have full-time jobs. It's really kind of a no-win situation. But getting back to, really focusing on the who of this virus, we do see once again that people of color are more likely to contract COVID. We've read all about this, but at some point, if you control by age, it doesn't really affect the fact that Black and Latino populations are significant or a number of times more likely to contract COVID. And that's been true throughout. And then if you look at the economic side of this, and here we're isolating, if you remember that map that I showed you of threatened workers earlier, if you take all those browns and all those orange colors, and those are going to represent sort of the 100 most economically vulnerable areas in the region, based on the percentage of workers who are working in those vulnerable industries, well, you'll see the disparities in those neighborhoods. Black populations are 5 times more likely to live in those economically vulnerable areas. Hispanic populations are about 4 times more likely to live in those areas. And you're also about 3 times more likely to not have health insurance if you live in those areas. And so let me kind of summarize here. If you look at any indicator that we're looking at, trying to get a handle on what this crisis is doing to our residents, well, the most vulnerable are getting the least out of this. And this is something that happened for decades prior to the pandemic. And the old saying goes, you never want to waste a good crisis. And what that means is, when we're in a crisis, we tend to do better thinking, we tend to do bolder thinking. But right now, we're wasting this crisis because we entered this pandemic as one of the least equitable places in the nation in terms of upward economic mobility, in terms of income inequality. And what we're seeing over and over again, no matter what you're looking at, is that those disparities and those inequities are widening during this crisis.
So that brings us to the last section, and I know we showed you a lot of information, but we are always thinking about where are we now, and more importantly, where do we think we're going to be? And so let's click to the next slide. This is Mike Carnathan's favorite slide. He loves the swooshes. Go back to your swooshes.
Yeah, so, early on, everyone was sort of converging around consensus of a V-shaped recovery. In other words, what that means is, yes, we're going to have a sharp drop, but we're going to rebound real quickly. Now consensus is emerging around kind of this Nike, almost a Nike type of swoosh, where yes, we see a drastic drop, and we do see a relatively quick rebound, but only rebounding to about 80 to 90% of where we were pre-pandemic. And that means, as we go on into 2021 and 2022, it's going to take us a while to fully recover the full effects of this economic damage. And we did some forecast scenarios in early April that we probably overshot a little bit, but we did show, based on what we knew at that point, that the Metro Atlanta would lose, somewhere in the magnitude of 500,000 jobs. We're not quite there yet. Moody's outlook is a little bit more optimistic. But no matter how you slice it, that V-shaped recovery to where, by the end of the year, we're just right back where we were at the beginning of the year, that seems more and more unlikely to happen.
And so this is something that our own Atlanta Federal Reserve built, and it's a calculator tool that allows you to adjust a target unemployment rate, and it will feed back to you in orange on the right part of that tool image that I put into this slide, how many jobs need to be added on average per month to get back to a target unemployment rate. And so it's updated twice now. Now I went and pulled, and Mike and I like to argue about it, historical data for Georgia. And 2010 and 2011 and 2012 weren't great years for Georgia, but we had some great years after that. We were slowing a little bit in 2019, but the average of the employment change over that 9-year long period was 7,000 jobs per month. So Georgia lost 492,000 jobs year over year, April 19 to April 20. And really that happened obviously in basically just under 2 months this year. So to get back to a 5% unemployment rate now, given that we had some job increases in the past couple months, we're looking at 8,200 jobs, which is more than the historical. But critically, if we don't see a strong uptick in jobs coming out of this recession, contrary to previous recessions, right? If we have to be very optimistic to get back quicker, we're going to be in for the long haul, and that's the critical point. So this tool, to get to that 5% unemployment rate now, we need to add 8,200 jobs, and it'll take us 60 months to get back to the previous employment. So what are we looking at for the future? It's really not a sharp V. It really is that Nike swoosh. It's going to take us a long time to recover out of this recession. And that's not a happy thing for us to say. We hope it goes better than that, but we're not alone in thinking this and using the Federal Reserve tool. Mike, if you go ahead and go to the next slide, Mike's going to walk you through this. This is, again, McKinsey. We're relying heavily today on McKinsey, but I think this is a great slide to explain it by sector, especially by sector by small business. I think you froze, Mike.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, this is actually Oxford Economics and McKinsey. You may have to handle this.
Yeah, let me.
Am I back?
A little bit. You're still a little blurry. But they.
Okay.
This is national data, but it's something we don't see very often. We haven't tabulated on our own. Is on that far right, the small business share of sector GDP. So if you look at the total economic output of a sector, what part of it is generated by small businesses? And some of it is very intuitive. Some of it, I'm like, that's a little surprising. And it's good to know because small businesses are such a big part of this recession in particular. And Mike, I think you're back now if you want to walk through sector detail.
Yeah, and what this is showing is it's showing you a couple of things. It's showing you a best case scenario where we have contained the virus, and we're also showing a worst case scenario where the virus is not recovered. And I think we know where we are in those two scenarios. But the white dots represent best case scenarios, black dots represent worst case scenarios. So you see some of the sectors up top, like arts and entertainment, accommodation, and food services, even in best case scenarios. McKinsey and Oxford Economics are not expecting these sectors to return to full strength until 2024. That is just so depressing to me that I don't have the words to describe that. And then you'll see some of the other sectors like educational services, other services, again, those high touch places like barbershops, nail salons. Depending on what the virus does, there's some pretty wide variation of when these sectors will return to full health. And then again, as Mike was saying, you can see the percentage of small businesses in each of these sectors as well. And so that's that's a downer slide to end on, but I mean, you came to the Mike and Mike show, you couldn't have possibly thought that we would be sharing good news with you. So here's just a couple of other things to sum up. We've talked about food insecurity. You know, during the summer months, it's been challenging. As soon as some of the relief funds start going away, if it does go away, well, we're still going to be dealing with high levels of food insecurity. If you look at our child care situation, 1 in 4 parents, and this is pre-pandemic, 1 in 4 parents had already indicated that they had to rearrange their work situation significantly due to child care challenges. Well, that's going to be even greater now. You saw the McKinsey report that Mike talked about, and we also did a recent study, or Learn for Life did a recent study showing localized effects of 3.5 to 5 percentage point drop in reading and math proficiency due to what happened at the end of the school year last year. Housing insecurity, we haven't really mentioned about evictions. Eviction moratoria are being extended, but once those moratoria end, most folks are talking like tsunami levels of evictions once the courts start hearing these proceedings again. Public transportation has just taken a beating. A lot of people don't feel safe taking ride sharing. And so that just adds to the struggles of our new essential workforce getting to work. And then finally, arts. We did a survey early on, and about 50% of those arts organizations reported that they have concerns being able to survive this. And so they were working on low margins already. And, COVID is just exposing those margins even further. And I believe this is the last slide that we have. And we're not really going to talk about it, but this just gives us some perspectives on what other people are thinking about, what life will be like, what lessons will we learn, and what lessons will we implement, given what we're going through with this pandemic. And so, Mike A., I'll turn it back over to you to close this up and to start.
Yeah, and I really hope everybody takes a second to click on the previous slide and look at those statements, because I think there's a lot there. There's a lot reflected in the presentation that we've done for you today. Obviously, we're focused on small business and low-income workers, especially workers of color, and the way we're thinking about the impacts of this recession. And it should be a time for us to be reflecting on really what that means and what we want to do for the future to make sure that if something like this happens again, that we're better prepared and we have put in place mechanisms to make sure that these impacts aren't as severe as they were before. So with that, I'm going to try to pull open the questions and run through them. So we have 33 questions. Some of those are comments, which we appreciate, and I'm going to run through them. We'll try to bat them around a little bit. Mike and I will. The first question that we actually need to answer is, who did the illustration? And it was David Dudley, the webmaster at the ARC. He's got a different title now, so Dave's on here. I apologize, but he had a lot of fun with that. Truthfully, it took us a long time to get our minds wrapped around actually using that years ago. But we thought, it's a pandemic crisis. We can sacrifice our dignity. And of course, a lot of people signed up for this webinar, so something worked. And I think it was that very comical graphic. And of course, Mike and I both have faces for radio. So
you can speak for yourself on that.
So anyway, yes, Mike, we know you need a new microphone. That's a reoccurring theme. So I promise you, Mike Harnathan will get a new microphone. So will you be addressing whether the pandemic will have long-term effect on the population projections for Metro Atlanta and the city of Atlanta? we often quote the growth projections as a driver for policy, and that's from Judy Yee. And yes, absolutely. I mean, the one thing we do at the ARC is we are continually planning. That's what we do. And Mike's shop is responsible for the long-range economic and population forecasts. And maybe you want to take a second to just talk about when we're likely to update those again.
Yeah, I mean, for this reason, because we can't, you know, when we let these forecasts, well, when we released these forecasts last year, guess what? We weren't planning on a pandemic. That was not part of our forecasting process the last time. And so that's why every 3 to 4 years, we reforecast. So we will be doing those forecasts again. And yes, I do expect that the pandemic will have long-term effects on what we're seeing in terms of population movements and job movements. And so while I don't know numbers yet, I will guarantee you that our forecasts, whenever we do them, probably 2022, will reflect what we're going through now, and you will see different forecast numbers for the city and the region as a whole. No doubt about it.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the next set of population estimates that we're about to release, and those are not forecasts, those are counts for April 2020, acknowledge some of the slowdown we were experiencing prior to this pandemic. So be aware of that. The next question, I think I'll probably take this one, is what are your thoughts? Should smaller cities contemplate rolling back density in areas that are identified for future growth? Should we be connecting density to virus spread, or should be connecting virus spread to individual behavior and not solely due to density? And I think for us, Mike and I were working on this PowerPoint, and I pulled up a Zillow report that actually showed searches from the Zillow website and them cataloging where people are searching by zip code. And in fact, it showed the chart, and if you email me, I'll send it to you, showed declines in searches in suburban zip codes. But Mike and I immediately were like, well, what does that suburban zip code mean to Zillow? We're not exactly sure about that. But, you know, globally, some of the places that have the highest densities manage virus the best and have the lowest cases now of major developed countries. So I think there's little for us in everything we've seen, and we're certainly not experts on virus spread, to indicate that a pattern change is really necessary, given what I just said. Presentation will be available. All right, so what about the economist articles that are saying we're really going to feel things in August? And I think that's a great question too, because that speaks to really what is a national conversation about a new stimulus package, and that with the unemployment insurance benefits about to decline dramatically across the US, that spending, because the multipliers are very high on unemployment insurance and really spending associated with federal food programs, if those decline, then yes, it's going to get very hard, especially with the case rate data. And if we didn't convey that, I apologize. That's very much in our minds, that we're thinking about what could happen on that. And again, go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry. If you look at the spending levels of low-income workers, you know, their low-income families and households, their spending levels didn't really change. So in other words, whatever stimulus they got, it propped up their spending. But with stimulus going away, we can rightly expect that spending levels will decline too. And again, as Mike said earlier, consumer spending is 70% of how we define our economy. And so if consumer spending takes a dip, well, the economy is going to take a dip with it.
And to that end, I am going to paste in an article from Moody's.com about the pandemic crisis that I think is absolutely relevant to that question. And I'm going to put that, if I can figure out how to paste it into the chat, I will do that. Otherwise, we'll try to send it out separately. Let me go to the next question. So how does the Atlanta Metro low-income worker employment data break out by county? And that's from Claire Bartlett.
We can break it out by county, and so that one map that I showed you, and again, I encourage you to get on that website. It's that Raj Chetty Opportunity Insights website. They have collected a whole bunch of data and actually created an interactive map where it allows you to look zip code to zip code. And so again, you know, the low-income workers is going to be most affected in those areas that have lots of jobs in food and accommodation and leisure and hospitality sectors in general. So Fulton County, and you can actually see this in the sales tax data, and then how much those revenues have declined year over year. It's going to be those urban places that have lots of, say, hotels, lots of restaurants. Those are the counties that are going to suffer the most. And so it's those low-income workers, regardless of where they live. Now, remember, they can live somewhere else, but come into Fulton County and take those jobs. Those workers that are going to suffer. And it's in those places in Fulton County that has lots of jobs, or, you know, DeKalb County, there's those big urban places. Those are the ones where you're going to see that low-income employment drop the most.
Yeah, and so that probably Stephanie Taylor, Jessica, Nashville attracts a lot of tourism with people going to many bars and performances. With both closed, the amount of income and spending has gone down. Stephanie pointed out about the tornadoes.
Yeah, the tornadoes. Yeah, that's a good one.
That's a great point. Is this the right area? What are the top 3 nonprofit services are most critical now to address people issues? That's from Chandra Stevens Albright.
What's that question again?
What are the top 3 nonprofit services that are most critical now to address people-centered issues?
I mean, that's a great question, and that's something that Mike and I and really the entire team at ARC has been talking about a lot. I mean, this isn't, you know, what we're seeing is just unprecedented levels of unemployment. So our workforce development agencies and nonprofits and intermediaries are critical right now to figuring out what we can do to re-employ the, you know, hundreds of thousands that have lost their jobs here in Metro Atlanta. Food insecurity has been rising, and so that's another area of nonprofit help that we need, is to make sure that, you know, that basic needs are met. So think food, think housing, and so those probably, if you have to nail down 3, it would be, you know, it would be things like, you know, jobs, housing, food. But the point of the matter is that this is affecting all aspects. This is affecting education. This is affecting early child care. We need to start thinking about ways to make the system of supports that we have work for everybody. Meaning that, you know, if you're in need of housing supports, you're also likely going to need food supports. You're likely going to need job supports. You're likely going to need transportation supports. And right now, the way that we've designed our system of supports, everyone has to go to an individual agency or an individual nonprofit to get one of those supports. And it makes navigating that system very burdensome on people who need the most help. And so that's what my hope is coming out of this, is that we can figure out a way to make navigating that system of supports easier and kind of invert the burden from the person needing help to the system itself. So I know that was a very wordy answer to to a pretty simple question, but that's what we've been thinking a lot about, is inverting that burden.
Yeah, and I think given the number of questions and that we're way over time and they're still coming in, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to them all. I can't believe I'm saying that. But I want to be respectful of people's time. I know 214 people are still here, which we really appreciate. But if you need to go, we completely understand. We'll do 2 more. But I did want to say I was able to figure it out. In the handout section and in the GoToWebinar interface, you'll see that I put the actual deck itself. So you can get the deck there as well, not just as a link in the chat. And then I put the article from Mark Zandi about the pandemic economy. He does a weekly update. I think this one in particular is very relevant to a lot of the questions we received about the national economy. So please get that PowerPoint as well. So there was a question that I think is valuable about what resources are available to minority businesses to sustain operations when they aren't in a position to open. And I think the easiest response I can give, which isn't in any way to say there's an easy solution, is to make sure that you've, especially if you're in the city of Atlanta, that you've checked in with Invest Atlanta. They have built a number of programs around helping small businesses. I know we've quietly, Mike, myself, I think Tommy, everyone has been providing some data support to those initiatives. I don't know if Mike, if you want to add to that, but Metro Chamber and all the county chambers are very focused on this as well. So, you know, depending on where you are, you definitely should be reaching out to them. But Invest Atlanta in particular, I think has been great at trying to think of ways they could build programs to support small businesses.
Right, and it's not going to be enough, but yeah, that's the place that I would start to.
Yeah, this link is bad. No, well, that should be good. All right, yeah, the desks are up. And then Lateriza, McLaurin, Ryan, and I want to acknowledge her work as well. The Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative is there. She
Right.
is today on the webinar, and I know Mike and I think the world of that initiative too. So please reach out to the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. We got a question from Mike Gerber. That's a blast from the past for Mike and I.
Mike Gerber, wow.
I hope he's doing well. I hope you're doing well, Michael Gerber. So it boils down to what's the state policy response by Georgia and local government to address housing, food insecurity, and employment and other conditions facing Metro and Atlanta, Georgia residents. If we count only on the federal response like PPP and other CARES programs, it's not always the case that funds will flow to those most in need.
And Mike, you've always asked really good questions that I don't have a good answer to.
I know, and
a lot of it is, you know, which we're still waiting to see what happens in at least the housing realm of this. So far, renters are hanging pretty tough. They're mostly making their rent payments, but again, you know, once these eviction moratoria start wearing off, we'll see a rising tide of evictions for sure. And so again, I don't have a good answer to your question, and I'm sure there's somebody out there that actually does have a pretty good. I'm not that person.
I think some of this is just to remember the scale. A lot of the conversation we've been in, you know, it's very hard for a local government to scale to really meet the needs as Mr. Gerber outlined them in his question. It does take a federal response, and it's not always perfect. We know that, but given the scale of job layoffs, that's why you need federal unemployment insurance. There's no way really any state could meet that need completely on its own. Georgia actually had a a relatively large set aside for unemployment insurance compared to some other states. So if the average was 1, I think Georgia's was 1.21 above the average set aside. So in that particular area, Georgia was actually well prepared for the jobs layoffs. But again, that money can only last so long, and that's why the federal inputs and the stimulus was so important. And only Japan as a country put more money into stimulus than the United States.
And that stimulus did pay off. I mean, we delivered more meals to seniors thanks to CARES Act. And, you know, so there was a lot of, I mean, so those relief funds were funds well spent. And so so as Mike said, it will take a federal response because we need to keep those funds flowing, so we can keep doing those things like, you know, Meals on Wheels, replacing those congregate meals in senior centers and assisted living facilities, feeding kids, all of that. So, I mean, we'll see what comes out of Washington.
Yeah, and it's not to say that, you know, I think we've clearly acknowledged where we think some really critical issues are going to come to a head over the next couple of months. Housing security and food security are going to be a focus for everyone. They have to be, because we really can't contemplate what could potentially happen if some additional resources aren't made available. I got a text from Nick Messino. I hope you're doing well, Nick. Yes, I'm in the office. I'm in the office because all of our internet resources were cut, I think, accidentally at the poll. So I'm waiting on somebody to come out and fix, so I have to come into work. So I hope everybody out in Gwinnett's doing well, and I appreciate it. Yes, so it's nice to be back in the office with my famous picture that Mike Cornathan hung up of me right before I carried the spike in at the Atlanta United match last year. So lots of great questions. The one other thing we always want to end on, and Jared wanted us to end on a positive note, that baseball's back. I'm not a big baseball fan. Atlanta United is playing tonight at 8 o'clock against Columbus. They haven't scored a goal in like 4 matches or something like that. So I'm looking forward to the Atlanta United match. That is something I think we can all enjoy. Mike's a big baseball fan.
Yep, go Braves.
Go Braves. So yeah, Jared, that's for you to end on a happy note. If you have any questions or things you need help with, we do these webinars to help provide information, but you know, we're always trying to make sure that we're helping everybody we possibly can with the resources we have as well. We have a wonderful staff. Please go to the websites. They have built some really impressive tools to help you understand what's going on. We plan on doing these updates every couple months as this data renews. I mean, the critical thing for us is to try to build a lot of information into one deck so that you don't have to do all the research. We're doing it for you. So look for us to do this again in 2 months. We'll continue this webinar series. We really enjoy putting on these webinars because we think we can reach a lot of people and help our communities in the best way possible. So every Tuesday at 2:30 is when we set a target for these webinars. So look for further ARC emails about those. We'll work hard to give you great content. So Mike, thank you. You were
Thank you.
Awesome.
And we apologize for the slow start. There's always going to be a technical glitch.
I know. Yeah, but we rolled with it. Thanks everyone for the time.
All right, thanks guys.
Go United.
Go Braves.